Whispers of Forgotten Kingdoms. He begins where silence is deepest, in the hour before dawn, when stones seem to breathe and the earth sheds the heat of yesterday, and in that calm he allows the mind to wander across old floodplains and mountain passes, where empires once arranged themselves like constellations, bright and intricate, and now soothingly far. He speaks of them not as legends but as landscapes, because the truth of their passing rests not in miracles but in patient sediments, in bricks pressed by human hands and laid in courses that still hold their line even as roofs have fallen, in canals silted shut by seasons that kept no records except for rings of clay in broken jars, and he guides you slowly to the edge of each vanished domain, asking nothing of you except the attentiveness with which an outsider might peer into windows where no glass remains. He tells of the broad valley, where a bronze bell once called farmers to measure water, and of the hilltop where a citadel's walls register the sunset like an old diary. The texture of the stones rough with lichen that arrived long after kings were gone. And as he progresses, the names are offered gently: harbours without boats, courts without courtiers, granaries without grain, because names can wake the mind too abruptly, and the evening desires the soft footfall of generalities that later become precise. There was a city with streets laid in a perfect grid, its drains still clever, its reservoirs still sound, and when the rains failed or politics faltered, or caravans chose a different pass, the people folded their lives with the same orderliness as their town, leaving inscriptions on seals whose animals still look up expectantly. There was a capital on a limestone ridge, where rulers favoured the cool breath of caves in summer, and their masons cut facades that faced the sunrise as though to greet a certainty. Yet caravans that once coiled and uncoiled like bright ribbons across the sand began to loosen, and the ledger stones kept tally until the columns ceased. There was a highland kingdom whose terraces stepped down the slopes with a patience that praised gravity, each wall answering the one below, and the grain that rose from those steps paid for priests, scribes, and builders who thought in right angles and star charts. Yet fissures opened maybe in the slopes, maybe in the court, maybe in the calendar, and the sound of the terraces became again the sound of rain alone. In the telling, his voice stays unhurried, like a river in the dry season sliding through shaded bends. For the grandeur of rise and the hush of fall need the same tempo to be understood, and he reminds that what ended did not dissolve into myth so much as into routine elsewhere. For people are not dissolved by collapses, they disperse. They take their pots and styles with them, they braid their songs into new valleys, and thus the continuity of human breath moves on, even when stone stays. He is careful with causes, because the night prefers open questions, and because to assign a single reason to the loss of a world is to misunderstand the way a roof comes down beam by beam, joint by joint, a series of small decisions and small accidents that only later resemble an event. And so he lingers on details instead: the cool of fired brick, the chalky squeak of a stylus across damp clay, the hush of sandals on a temple floor, the scent of sesame ground at dawn, the glitter of lapis in a child's amulet, the tilt of a stair worn by heels turning always to the left, and each detail suggests a life, and each life suggests a city, and each city suggests a realm where taxes were collected, treaties sworn, fires banked, and bedtime stories told the proof that empires are made from households, and that the end of an empire is the quiet packing of rooms. He widens the frame, letting you see coastlines that were once closer or farther than they are now, the breath of the sea in and out over centuries, harbours now stranded like fish on a shelf of rock, while other harbours drowse beneath green water, where fishermen cast nets that snag on capitals and cornices. And he notes that geography is a long conversation between land and time, in which humans speak only a little while. Then he guides you inland along roads that still hold a faint crown in the centre, the sign of careful engineering that declined to disappear. And these roads are not haunted by armies but by mule trains, merchants counting under their breath, and innkeepers who learn to hear the value of a cargo by the creak of its straps. And when the road ceases, at a washout or a dune, he does not stop but steps into the blank with the same composure as a surveyor, because history is often a matter of bridging small gaps with plausible planks, and the planks here are made of weather, crop yields, marriage alliances, and the stubborn arithmetic of distance. He pauses at a line of pylons, breasting a riverbank, describing the way sunlight slips along their edges at an angle that repeats every year, and how the builders must have smiled to see the pattern recur, for recurrence is the parent of ritual, ritual the parent of assurance, and assurance the parent of states. Yet even parents cannot protect children from time, and so the pylon inscriptions weathered, the paint fled, the priests who traced their fingers over the carved verbs left no sons in the office, and the rituals, whose calendars had once held the sky still, loosened by a day here, a week there, until the year itself seemed only a custom. He remembers an empire of gardeners, whose canals laced the plain so finely that rice could root where drought had ruled, and the lords of that water wrote laws about sluice gates more carefully than they wrote songs, and perhaps a war came, or only a long processional of repairs postponed, and the water's attention drifted, bypassing fields, collecting where it should not, nursing fever where it pooled, and the gardeners became migrants, their knowledge travelling like a seed, light, winged, impossible to confiscate. He recalls a federation of hill towns that spoke mutually intelligible tongues, yet disagreed on emphasis, whose potters shaped the same handsome rim but painted different birds, and their confederation worked. Albeit with the effort, all confederations require frequent meetings, gifts, weddings, insults forgiven after a harvest until a quarry played out, or a pass iced too many winters in a row, and the traffic that had funded their arguments went quiet, leaving the towns friendlier in memory than they had been in practice. And this too is how empires end, not by thunder but by a soft subtraction of reasons to remain bound. He notices a pattern the knight seems glad to underline: how power loves the edge between terrains, how palaces rise, where mountain gives way to plain, where river hands its burden to sea, where forest encounters steppe, and he suggests, in the slow cadence of a teacher before sleep, that edges are fruitful but fragile, and that empire is often the confidence to stand at an edge and promise to hold it forever, a promise kept only as long as caravans arrive, or snows come exactly as expected, or letters move along the route at a known pace, and when any of these small assurances falter, the edge loosens, and the palace's grand staircase will someday serve as a slope for goats. He walks you through markets that are no longer there, except for the aptitude of their surviving thresholds, markets that once could tell the news by the texture of spices under the fingers, where cinnamon roughened the thumb in one decade and smoothed it in the next as distant growers changed their curing. And such minute facts are the weather of trade, and trade is the weather of empire. And when that weather shifts, the sky of sovereignty looks the same, until suddenly it does not, and rulers wake, too late, to find that their taxes are counted in a measure no longer respected beyond the third milestone. He evokes a library that never quite surrendered, where a room collapsed but another endured, and a traveller, centuries later, found a stack of damp manuscripts jammed under a fallen lintel, illegible but at least present, a proof that forgetting is not always an act but sometimes a condition of materials. And the traveller, lacking funds and a mule, copied a few lines, as travellers do, and carried them into a new town where a new scribe read them, puzzled over a rare word, guessed, altered, improved, and in that chain of fidelity and error, the old empire kept breathing, not as power, but as vocabulary. He shows a temple court paved in a stone that holds the day's warmth, and he lets the evening linger there, explaining how the last caretaker must have swept the dust while waiting for a procession that never came, looked up at the roof line when a bird startled, the vanished river cities. The tale turns to the rivers, those quiet sculptors of history, and the voice leads you into valleys where once waters curved through fertile fields and cities blossomed upon their banks, each settlement a pearl upon the thread of the stream. He tells how rivers gave not only drink but measure, their rhythms teaching humans how to count, how to plan, how to gather surplus into storehouses whose clay seals still bear the press of officials' rings. Yet rivers are also fickle, shifting in channels, swallowing towns with a sudden flood, or else retreating, leaving dry beds where once fishermen strung nets. And so, Entire cities that had once mirrored the course of a living waterway became orphaned, stranded in dust, and their people drifted away to follow the current elsewhere. In this slow narration, he pauses at one ancient basin where farmers carved canals as delicate as veins, coaxing rice and millet to sprout where before only reeds grew, and from this abundance rose halls of council, markets, and temples. But when the river altered its course in one decisive season, those canals ran dry, cracks forming like wrinkles across the land, and the farmers departed, their irrigation works crumbling into scars across the plain. He recalls another civilization that mastered floods, erecting levees higher each year, learning to speak the language of mud, their scribes recording not only prayers but flood heights, the ink lines rising and falling like a pulse. And for generations this balance held, until a flood too great or a levee too neglected swept away the boundary, drowning grain stores and breaking the faith of thousands, and within a decade the place was left to reeds and stalks, its columns leaning out of silt like bones. Yet he does not dwell in tragedy, for these stories are told gently, as though the rivers themselves desired only change, not cruelty, and each vanished city left gifts in its passing, pottery carried to distant markets, stories carried in the tongues of refugees, songs of water sung in lands where rain was the only river. He tells of explorers centuries later who wandered into these dried basins, marveling at streets aligned so neatly that they seemed to await their citizens' return, of baked brick walls still standing shoulder to shoulder as though in council, and of wells whose rings of stone were polished smooth by generations drawing water. He notes how silence rests differently upon these ruins, softer, as if the river's memory continues to hum beneath the ground, and he imagines, for you, the sight of a moonlit channel now long deserted, its banks grown wild with tamarisk, its bed strewn with shards of painted clay, and he explains that while kingdoms may vanish, the river always keeps a trace of them, folding fragments into its sediment, so that far downstream a pot's handle or a bead of turquoise may emerge from the mud in another age. The lesson drifts like the river's own current, that empire is often only as lasting as the waters that sustain it, and when those waters wander, the cities must choose between following or fading, and most often they fade, leaving only whispers upon the banks. Stone guardians in the desert. In the stillness of desert night, the story bends toward statues that rise like islands from waves of sand, their outlines half buried, half revealed, as though time itself could not decide whether to conceal them or display them, and the voice guiding you moves slowly, describing the way moonlight clings to their faces, casting shadows across cheeks and brows carved thousands of years ago by hands that have long since dissolved to dust. He tells you that these colossi once lined avenues leading to palaces and temples, their presence less ornamental than protective, for to the people who raised them, stone was a form of eternity, a promise that rulers and gods would not be forgotten even if walls crumbled, and so they carved guardians, lions with human eyes, kings with folded arms, birds with wings spread so wide that storms seemed to gather beneath them. In the ages of their making, desert winds were not yet victorious, for canals laced the land and orchards thrived in the irrigation, and the statues were landmarks for caravans bringing incense and lapis from far ridges. But as centuries unrolled, the winds grew louder, and the sands advanced, swallowing courtyards and gardens, pressing against the plinths of the stone guardians. Still the guardians remained, heads lifted, their silence as eloquent as any proclamation once chiselled into a tablet, and when the last households left, the statues stayed, inheriting the kingdom like reluctant heirs who could do nothing but watch over the empty houses. He draws your attention to the detail, the faint curl of a sculpted lip, the careful groove that once suggested hair, the precision of hieroglyphs worn nearly flat details that suggest not just grandeur but intimacy, a mason's concentration, a community's patience, and as you picture them, you also hear the low hum of desert air, a constant sound that carries both menace and peace. Wanderers who stumbled upon these figures centuries later thought them giants, beings from another age, their heads protruding from dunes like sentinels petrified by the wrath of gods, and indeed, Such interpretations suited the silence, for the guardians offer no explanation, only their gaze across the horizon. He describes how excavation revealed not only the visible torsos, but entire bodies still attached, colossal legs planted in earth, inscriptions wrapped around bases like belts, and small votive offerings left at their feet. Amulets of faience, broken jars, the ashes of burned resin, each relic whispering that the statues were not alone in their standing, but once part of a choreography of devotion and authority. And yet, the reason why the cities they protected vanished is never settled. Some say drought stretched too long, others that trade paths shifted, or perhaps that political struggles loosened the grip of dynasties. But all such explanations become thin when you stand before the stone guardians, because their persistence seems to mock human temporality, their watch enduring even when memory falters. He notes how travelers describe the guardians at dawn, their surfaces glowing as though lit from within, and at dusk, when the sun falls behind them, they become silhouettes, dark hieroglyphs against the reddened sky, and this daily rhythm becomes their unspoken language, a cycle they repeat without fail, even though no priest recites invocations anymore. The desert itself participates in the mystery, the sands shifting with storms so that one season a guardian's face is hidden to the nose, another season its shoulders are freed, as if the earth itself plays with the visibility of the past, teasing later generations with fragments, withholding the whole. He lingers on the thought that the guardians, in their silence, may have outlived the very reasons for which they were built. For empires raise monuments to permanence, but permanence turns out to be less about dominance and more about waiting, enduring without explanation, until the desert itself becomes their temple. In your imagination, he guides you closer, so close that you can almost feel the texture of the stone, roughened by sandblasts yet still warm from the day's sun, and he invites you to rest in that stillness. For the guardian's watch is not hurried, and their patience, like the desert's, is endless. And so, the section closes with the gentle assurance that even in lands where all else has perished, the guardians remain, not to frighten but to remind that memory itself can take the shape of stone, surviving not with answers but with presence, and in their shadow you may sleep, knowing that mysteries need not be solved to be comforting. The collapse of towers. The voice turns now towards cities whose pride had always been expressed in their towers, those vertical declarations that rose like stone prayers, challenging both the horizon and the heavens, as though to prove that human hands could coax permanence out of earth itself. In the slow telling, he describes how towers once guided travelers across plains, their outlines visible from days away, beckoning caravans toward markets where goods sparkled beneath awnings, and how bells or drums at their summits marked the hours for farmers in fields below, the sound rolling across valleys in even cadence. Yet, as the story unfolds gently, you see that each tower carried within it the seeds of its undoing, for height was both an achievement and a danger, demanding maintenance, demanding vigilance, demanding a society's continued stability, and when that stability fractured through famine, through war, through neglect, the towers did not fade gradually like walls or houses, but toppled suddenly, their collapse echoing across generations. He paints the image of masons at work centuries earlier, balancing on scaffolds woven from timber, lifting stones with pulleys creaking under strain, and inscribing prayers beneath the foundations, believing that such offerings would anchor the tower not only in soil but in eternity. For a while, the prayers seemed answered, for the towers stood straight, their upper chambers catching the first light of morning, their shadows falling long in evening, symbols of a city's vigour. And yet time, as always, proved to be the stronger architect. He recalls one city where 3 towers once stood in a triangle, marking the quarters of artisans, merchants, and priests, and each quarter rivaled the others in the beauty of their tower, raising them ever higher, until scaffolds kissed the clouds. But rivalry bred neglect of other needs, granaries unstocked, walls unrepaired, alliances ignored, and when drought struck, the towers became monuments of misplaced pride, rising above a hungry population until one collapsed during a storm, sending stone tumbling through the market below, and within a generation the other 2 followed. whether by decay or dismantling, leaving only foundations that later shepherds mistook for natural ridges. He lets you linger at another ruin, this one in a coastal land, where fishermen once told time by the tower's shadow stretching across the water. The tower's base still stands, massive blocks interlocked so tightly that knives cannot slip between them, but the upper stories are scattered, tumbled like dice, as though the sea itself rolled them. Yet no invasion is recorded, and no fire scorched the stones, only the silence of abandonment, suggesting that the people simply walked away, leaving their tower to fall at its own pace, its grandeur crumbling with no witnesses except gulls and waves. He speaks softly of the paradox. Towers intended to last forever become among the first ruins to command attention, for their collapse is visible, dramatic, impossible to mistake. Unlike the slow fading of a marketplace or the quiet drying of canals, towers do not fade, they fall. And in falling they tell the story of impermanence more starkly than any chronicle. He recounts an explorer in later centuries who camped beside a fallen tower, noting in his journal how the blocks lay like a puzzle flung apart, their inscriptions still sharp, their surfaces polished by ancient hands. The explorer wrote that it seemed the city had gathered all its strength to rise toward the heavens, only to learn that heaven had no interest in bargains of stone, and so the tower had returned to earth. The storyteller then guides you deeper into thought, suggesting that perhaps towers fall not only from neglect, but from the weight of symbolism itself. For a tower represents unity, labor, ambition, and pride. And when those threads unravel, the structure, no matter how strong, stands hollow, waiting for the first storm to reveal the emptiness beneath. And so, in the cadence of a lullaby, he concludes that towers are not failures but reminders, teaching that height without balance is fragile, that ambition without care is brittle, and that what matters most is not the pinnacle reached, but the harmony maintained at the base. In this way, the collapse of towers becomes not a catastrophe, but a lesson whispered through stone, and as the night deepens, you are invited to rest beneath that whisper, secure in the knowledge that even ruins can hold meaning. Even fragments can cradle the memory of greatness without demanding an answer, only offering the calm of reflection. Echoes of silent marketplaces. The voice drifts now into the narrow streets of vanished bazaars, where once 1,000 conversations mingled in the air, weaving a tapestry of barter and laughter and argument. And though centuries have since emptied these alleys, the imagination is urged to wander there slowly, to hear faint traces of those voices, as though the stone itself remembers. He tells you how markets were the beating hearts of empires, places where distant valleys and far harbours met in baskets of figs, bolts of dyed linen, ingots of copper, jars of oil, and tiny tokens of glass or shell. The market was never still, for morning brought the clatter of carts arriving with fresh produce. Afternoon shimmered with the heat of trade, and evening lingered with music from street performers, their melodies bending into the night. Yet now, as he leads you through these ghostly streets, only the wind inhabits them, carrying dust instead of words, and what remains are the worn thresholds where merchants once sat cross-legged, the grooves on paving stones where countless wheels had passed, and the faint outlines of stalls marked by stone slabs, tilted against walls long crumbled. He recalls one empire whose capital was famed for a marketplace so vast that travellers described it as a city within a city, with quarters for every craft. The bronze workers striking sparks under awnings, the weavers stretching threads across looms while shouting prices, the spice sellers whose stalls bloomed with colours and scents so rich they made visitors dizzy. Yet in later centuries, when the caravans faltered and ships chose new harbours, the stalls stood empty, one by one, and soon even the guards who once patrolled the gates abandoned their posts. By the time later wanderers arrived, only wild grasses sprouted in the corners, and foxes traced the paths where once the richest fabrics had been displayed. In another tale, he describes a desert outpost whose market thrived because of a single well, a deep shaft that drew caravans for refreshment. Around this well, leather workers, metal smiths, and jewel sellers flourished, trading goods that came from hundreds of miles away. But one season the well collapsed, its walls caving under pressure, and without water the caravans turned aside, leaving the merchants with wares no one came to buy. They drifted away like the water itself, and the market became a ring of abandoned stalls, still echoing with the memory of bargaining voices. He speaks slowly of the small details that breathe life into ruins. The charred ring of a hearth, where a cellar once cooked meals for customers. The imprint of scales carved into stone, showing where weights had been balanced countless times. The faint traces of paint on a wall where prices had been written in ochre. These traces, though silent, are not empty. They hum with the residue of lives lived, transactions made, hopes exchanged with coins and tokens. He reminds you that markets were not only about goods, but about news, rumors of distant wars, tidings of harvests, songs from foreign tongues, and when markets died, empires lost their ears and voices, for without exchange of words as much as goods, their edges grew brittle. He leads you gently through the idea that marketplaces were mirrors of stability. When grain was plentiful, stalls overflowed. When harvests failed, the market faltered first. When rulers taxed too heavily, merchants muttered and vanished. And when peace reigned, laughter returned, clattering like cymbals. And so, their silence today is not merely absence, but a record, an inscription written in emptiness. As night deepens, the storyteller invites you to picture a moonlit arcade, pillars casting long shadows, the open square deserted except for wind curling through, stirring fragments of pottery, and he assures you that even this silence carries comfort, for the market has not truly died. It lingers in the imagination, in the memories of objects that travelled far and wide, in the spices whose seeds still sprout, in the crafts that descendants continued elsewhere. The silence, then, is not a void but a lull, a long pause after a song, inviting you to listen not with ears but with breath, to feel how empires whisper, not only in victories but in their stillness after the crowd has gone. Temples without gods. The voice turns towards sanctuaries, vast and solemn, that once lifted their columns like forests of stone, roofs heavy with carved stars, floors smoothed by the countless feet of worshippers, yet now stand in emptiness, their gods absent, their prayers forgotten, their rituals silenced. And as he speaks, you walk slowly with him through halls where only owls perch, their wings brushing the dust of ages, where ivy or desert grasses creep through broken lintels, where incense once burned in clouds but now the air is cool and still. He tells you gently that temples were once the anchors of empires, not merely shrines but centers of power, wealth, and order, for from them priests announced calendars, measured the seasons, kept records of tribute, and declared which kings ruled with divine favor. They were as much offices of state as houses of gods, and their grandeur reflected both devotion and governance. But when empires faltered, the temples faltered too, not always from conquest or fire, sometimes simply from neglect, as generations lost the memory of which offerings pleased which deity, or which chants unlocked favor, until at last the sanctuaries were entered by silence rather than crowds. He recalls a highland kingdom, where sanctuaries were carved directly into cliffs, facades of pillars and pediments hewn from living rock, their chambers lit by torches that reflected gold on the walls, and within those chambers priests traced star maps upon the ceilings, believing themselves to keep the cosmos in rhythm with their rituals. Yet one winter, famine spread, and offerings dwindled. Without grain, without oil, the rites grew thin, and when the priesthood weakened, the sanctuaries lost their heartbeat. Centuries later, travelers found them, their facades eroded by wind, their chambers empty except for bats, the stars still painted above but no one left to read them. In another land, he tells of wooden temples built upon stilts beside rivers, structures alive with the creak of timbers and the scent of resin, where every spring worshippers launched boats filled with flowers and lamps. Gifts floated downstream to unseen spirits. But when floods altered the river's course, leaving the stilts stranded upon mud, the rituals lost their setting, the priests departed, and the structures sagged, dissolving back into the soil until only outlines remained. He moves slowly, lingering on the paradox. Gods are thought eternal, yet the houses built for them crumble. Prayers are thought immortal, yet the words slip from memory when lips no longer repeat them. And so, temples become shells, containers of vanished faiths, their stones waiting for meanings that never return. Yet, he says gently, these ruins are not sad but serene, for absence has given them a new holiness, a holiness of quiet, where no demands are made, where one may sit and hear only the hush of wind and the faint trickle of rainwater dripping from cracks. He guides your eyes to small details, altars still darkened from centuries of fire, staircases polished from millions of pilgrim feet, inscriptions half erased by weather yet still showing fragments of supplication. These details remind you that behind the grandeur, the temples were sustained by ordinary hands, the woman grinding grain for offering bread, the mason carving one more lotus onto stone, the child holding a torch aloft in ceremony. Their lives, too, are now gone, and what remains is not the sound of devotion but its imprint. In a slow, soothing cadence, he reflects that every empire's temples will someday be without gods, for beliefs shift, rituals evolve, and what is sacred in one age becomes forgotten in another. Yet the beauty of the ruins lies precisely in their stillness, their refusal to demand belief, their offering of space simply to rest. And so, under moonlight, a ruined sanctuary becomes not a void but a gentle reminder that all empires pass, but in their passing, they leave places where one can sit, listen, and drift into peace, as if in the company of ancient prayers, ships stranded on dry earth. The voice leads you now from the silence of abandoned temples to landscapes even stranger, where vessels built for waves and tides stand marooned upon barren earth, their ribs bleaching in the sun, their hulls tilted at awkward angles like fish tossed upon a shore that never knew the sea. And he explains in calm tones that once these ships were proud, carved and caulked with skill, their sails swelling like wings, their decks alive with the cries of sailors and merchants, their holds packed with grain, wine, copper, ivory, or spices destined for distant harbours. Yet when the waters receded, or when earth itself rose and pushed seas away, ships that once danced upon currents were left stranded, frozen mid-journey, monuments of confusion for those who came centuries later. He tells of one desert plain where storms occasionally uncover the timbers of a vessel so vast it must have carried hundreds, its planks fastened with bronze nails that still gleam beneath the sand. Local legends whisper that it was a punishment from the gods. A crew of arrogant mariners turned to silence and stranded where no tide would ever reach. But the storyteller gently reminds you that the truth is simpler and more mysterious at once. A river once flowed there, broad and deep enough to carry fleets, and when it dried, the ships had no escape. Their anchors sunk into dust instead of water. In another land, he describes an inland sea that slowly shrank, century after century, until towns that had once lived by fishing found themselves miles from the shore. Their boats were dragged onto sledges and left, awaiting water that never returned, and over generations those boats became barns, houses, even foundations for new villages, until their original purpose was forgotten, leaving only the question of why a keel should lie so far from any wave. He lingers on the imagery, letting you see the cracked boards, the mast stumps pointing skyward like lonely trees, the way dunes wrap themselves around prows as though to comfort them. He tells of sailors' carvings still etched into beams, names, prayers, tiny figures of dolphins, and how these carvings now face the endless desert, their prayers unanswered, their dolphins swimming only in memory. Explorers centuries later stumbled upon such relics and felt the uncanny sensation of being watched by the past, for ships in the desert seem like dreams left behind, reminders that geography is never fixed, that water and land exchange places with the patience of eternity. And softly, he draws the reflection that empires too are like ships, built for movement, for trade, for expansion, yet often left stranded when their rivers of fortune shift, when their seas of commerce dry. What once carried them forward becomes the very image of their immobility, and their ruins rest not in flames, but in stillness, waiting to be covered by the sand, to be rediscovered by another age. Yet there is no bitterness in this fate. A stranded ship, like a sleeping giant, is not defeated but at rest, and its timbers tell a story more lasting than its voyages. So he invites you to linger with that image, a ship resting on cracked earth, its shadow long in the moonlight, the wind humming gently through empty portholes, the stars reflected not in waves but in polished planks. And as you imagine it, the silence of the desert seems almost like the sea again, carrying you softly into the currents of sleep. The city of eternal night. The voice lowers, softer now, as though guiding you into a dream, and he tells of a capital once celebrated for its brilliance, a place where lamps burned at every corner and towers shimmered with polished stone, where nights were filled with music, markets glowed with lanterns, and the streets never truly darkened. Yet this same city is remembered in legend for having slipped into a shadow from which it never returned, vanishing beneath a blanket of night that seemed to grow thicker with every passing season. Slowly, he describes how travelers once approached its gates and found them closed, how no torches burned upon its walls, and how silence replaced the hum of crowds. The city's name was whispered in astonishment across neighboring lands, but no envoy ever returned with news of its revival. Only tales of streets empty as tombs, houses shuttered, gardens withered, and wells untended. He explains in his calm, patient cadence that some believe the city's decline came from the sky itself, a long season of storms, volcanic ash, or mists so heavy that the sun could not break through, forcing crops to fail and hearths to burn dim. Others speak of plague, a sickness that spread so swiftly that doors were barred, neighbors abandoned, and lamps extinguished until darkness became the city's final shroud. Yet whatever the truth, the result was the same. The once luminous capital slipped into legend as a place where night never ended. He leads you into its deserted avenues, describing how shadows fall over the worn stones, how windows gape like empty eyes, and how the air feels heavy, as if time itself has slowed to a hush. But even here, beauty lingers. He points to mosaics along the streets, their colors still faintly glimmering when moonlight touches them, patterns of stars and suns ironically preserved in a city that lost the sky. He shows you doorways framed with carvings of radiant gods, their faces eroded but still smiling faintly as though mocking the darkness that conquered their domain. He imagines the sound of wind echoing through the great amphitheater, where once voices soared in hymns and songs, now replaced by a single, lonely note that rises and fades with each gust. And he tells you of later wanderers who entered the city, carrying torches that barely pierced the gloom, and who left again unsettled, convinced that the shadows there were thicker than anywhere else, as though the stones themselves exhaled night. He reflects that every empire has its night, a time when light recedes, when order collapses, when silence deepens. Yet in this city's fate there is no cruelty, only the inevitability of change. Night here is not punishment but rest, a permanent sleep for walls that once glowed with festivals. And in his slow, reassuring tone, he reminds you that darkness is not always emptiness. It can be shelter, a cradle, a veil that allows what is weary to finally lie still. So he invites you to rest within that thought. A city of eternal night, its towers softened by shadow, its streets blanketed in quiet, its story incomplete yet strangely soothing. And as you imagine its lamps long extinguished, you find yourself carried deeper into the embrace of night, comforted by the notion that even endings can glow softly in memory. Sealed libraries of stone. The voice carries you now into the heart of silence, toward chambers carved and walled with such care that they became prisons not for men, but for knowledge itself, libraries bound not in leather but in stone, sealed so tightly that centuries passed without a single hand disturbing their contents. He tells you that in many vanished empires, rulers and priests feared forgetting even more than death, and so they inscribed their wisdom upon clay, upon papyrus, upon wax and bronze, storing it in rooms meant to last beyond storms, beyond wars, beyond time itself. Yet sometimes, in their zeal to preserve, they sealed too well, locking their treasures behind slabs of granite or burying them under earth, so that when the kingdoms fell, the libraries remained but inaccessible, like thoughts trapped forever in a sleeping mind. He recalls the desert kingdom whose scribes worked by lamplight, chiseling line after line of hymns, laws, and treaties onto tablets. stacking them carefully in chambers lined with cedar planks. When enemy armies threatened, the priests, in their desperation, sealed the doors with clay and invoked curses upon any who would break them. The invaders came and went, the empire fell, but the chambers endured, entombed beneath sand. Centuries later, travelers discovered a half-buried doorway, but when they struck at it, the stone resisted, their tools broke, and the desert swallowed the passage once more. The tablets inside still rest unseen, their words perhaps the last intact memory of a people whose name has faded even from maps. In another land, he says, deep within mountains, there are rumors of a chamber lined with copper shelves, where scrolls of beaten gold once gleamed, inscribed with star charts and rituals. The miners who found its entrance centuries later dared not open it, fearing collapse or divine retribution, and so the library remains sealed, its treasures waiting. He reminds you that knowledge can be as fragile as it is durable. Ink fades, papyrus crumbles, but stone and clay endure, carrying words like seeds, dormant until the right hands awaken them. Yet these libraries, locked and hidden, became seeds that never sprouted, whole worlds of thought left unread. He slows his tone, guiding your attention to the imagery of dust settling on shelves, of darkness holding shelves in its arms, of silence protecting fragile pages from fire and damp. In this silence, he suggests, there is both loss and grace, for while no eyes may ever read those texts again, the fact that they remain untouched means they are still whole, still intact, preserved in purity, even if never to be known. And as he reflects, he notes that every empire, in its own way, builds sealed libraries, sometimes with stone, sometimes with memory, sometimes with unspoken stories passed through families until silence claims them. The mystery of what is lost is itself a kind of presence, a reminder that human ambition reaches not only outward into towers and markets, but inward into words and ideas. So he leaves you with the image of a hidden chamber beneath a quiet hill, stone doors closed, the weight of centuries pressing gently upon them, within which rest rows upon rows of tablets, scrolls, and fragments, waiting patiently in darkness. They will likely never be opened, yet their very existence lends the night a certain calm that within the forgotten, knowledge still dreams, undisturbed, eternal as sleep. Disappearance of the artisans. The story drifts now into the quiet mystery of vanished hands, those who once shaped stone into lions, bronze into bells, and silk into banners, artisans whose skill defined the beauty of empires, yet who, in time, seem to vanish without heirs, leaving unfinished works and crafts never seen again. Slowly, the voice guides you through the streets where workshops once rang with hammer blows, chisels tapping, looms clicking, kilns glowing orange in the dusk. You are asked to imagine the heat of furnaces, where glass melted into beads, the fragrance of cedar shavings, as carpenters carved intricate panels, the rhythm of potters' wheels spinning clay into form. These artisans were the pulse beneath the grandeur of rulers, for their skill gave empires their face. Temples rose because masons built them, palaces dazzled because jewelers adorned them, festivals shimmered because weavers labored at their looms. And yet, in empire after empire, a moment comes when their workshops fall silent, and the skills that had seemed eternal disappear as though folded into air. He recalls one kingdom famed for its enamel work, vibrant colors fused onto metal, creating vessels that shone like jewels. Travelers carried these treasures across deserts and seas, yet when the capital fell, the enamelers vanished too, leaving no apprentices, no manuals, no continuity, as if the very technique had been exhaled from the world. Later generations held the vessels, marveling at the colors that could not be replicated, and wondered what secret combination of fire, mineral, and patience had been lost. In another land, he describes sculptors who carved basalt so finely that faces seemed alive, eyes glimmering, robes flowing, their workshops lined entire streets. Yet one day, without siege or plague, the chisels fell still. Whether they departed in migration, whether they died in famine, or whether their craft was forbidden by new rulers, none can say. What remains are unfinished statues, torsos without heads, half-smoothed limbs, blocks of stone abandoned mid-carving, as if the artisans vanished mid-breath, their skill carried away into silence. The storyteller lingers on the fragility of skill, how it depends on transmission from hand to hand, master to apprentice, gesture to gesture. He speaks softly of how even the smallest interruption, a famine scattering families, a war destroying workshops, a decree silencing certain crafts can break the chain, and once broken, centuries cannot repair it. Yet, he reminds you that even in loss there is beauty, for the unfinished works hold a poignancy that complete ones do not. A half-painted fresco where brushstrokes still whisper of the artist's last morning, a loom left threaded with a pattern never woven, a harp carved but never strung. These fragments tell a story of humanity interrupted, not destroyed, lingering like echoes in the air, and he draws a gentle reflection that perhaps artisans do not wholly vanish, but their skills disperse, scattered like pollen, a potter's hand remembered in a distant village, a metallurgist's technique echoed in another land, a weaver's pattern faintly reappearing centuries later in a fabric across the sea. In this way, disappearance may only be dispersal, the craft transformed beyond recognition, surviving invisibly. So he leaves you with the image of a darkened workshop, its tools resting quietly where they were last placed, dust thick upon the benches, shafts of sunlight filtering through broken shutters. No voices, no flames, only stillness, and in that stillness, the lingering warmth of hands that once knew how to shape the world. It is not a sorrowful silence, but a tender one, an invitation to rest with the memory that creation itself, like empire, is fragile, fleeting, and yet always beautiful in its impermanence, the kingdom that burned itself. The voice lowers, weighted now with the strange gravity of a people who, for reasons still uncertain, turned their own flame against themselves, as though destruction were chosen rather than imposed. Slowly, he draws you into the story of a kingdom that once glittered with storehouses of grain, halls of cedar and gold, processions of priests bearing banners of flame for ritual, but whose final chapter was not conquest from without but fire from within. Archaeologists, centuries later, found layers of ash so thick that whole streets were sealed beneath them, walls scorched black, clay tablets hardened by heat, as if the city itself had been offered as a single vast sacrifice. He explains gently that in times of famine or despair, people have turned to fire as both end and purification. Perhaps this kingdom feared an enemy and chose to leave nothing behind, torching their own granaries and palaces so invaders would inherit only smoke. Or perhaps plague had spread, and the fire was meant as cleansing, a desperate attempt to burn sickness from the air. Or perhaps belief itself demanded it some prophecy, some priestly decree that only in fire could the people join their gods. The truth lies buried in charred beams and vitrified stone, silent testimony to choices lost in time. He recalls how excavators uncovered an entire quarter of workshops, their kilns fused into rubble, tools left upon benches as if artisans fled mid-task, flames overtaking them too swiftly to save even their simplest belongings. In another district, a temple was found where statues of deities had been toppled and burned, their faces cracked from heat, offerings melted into slag, as if worship itself had been consumed. Yet strangely, amidst the devastation, some chambers remained sealed, their contents untouched, suggesting that the fire was deliberate, guided, not random, an act not of chaos, but of intent. The storyteller lingers on the paradox of fire, how it destroys, yet also preserves. He tells you how scrolls that might have rotted were carbonized instead, surviving in fragments, how clay tablets, baked in flames, became more durable, hardened into near eternity. Thus, in burning, the kingdom both erased and immortalized itself, leaving behind relics that might otherwise have dissolved. He lets you imagine the glow of flames reflected in night skies, entire skylines of towers collapsing in sparks, the air thick with smoke carrying the scent of cedar, resin, flesh, and grain. It was an ending that must have seemed apocalyptic, yet now, seen across the gulf of centuries, it is strangely calm, a completed circle. He softens his tone, reminding you that all empires burn eventually, whether by enemy hand, accident, or neglect, and that fire is simply one form of time, swift and visible, whereas others wind, rain, silence, work more slowly. To burn is not uniquely tragic. It is only a quicker transformation, and so, the kingdom that burned itself has become a symbol not of despair but of release, a people who left their story in firelight, a dark brilliance visible still in the layers of earth. He leaves you with the image of glowing embers cooling to ash, smoke dispersing into the night, and under that quiet veil the city rests forever. Its flames have gone, but their echo remains, and in that echo you may find a strange serenity that even destruction, when complete, becomes stillness, becomes peace, becomes a long and dreamless sleep, unfinished palaces of dust. The story glides now into the realm of beginnings that never reach their ends, palaces raised half from earth before silence claimed them, stairways that ascend into air without landing, walls that halt abruptly, carved blocks stacked but never smoothed, as though time itself called the workers away and left the skeletons of ambition behind. The voice invites you to imagine walking slowly among these unfinished halls, their outlines clear, yet their grandeur unfulfilled, a dream of kingship arrested mid-breath. He explains softly that empires often build in confidence, believing tomorrow will always provide more hands, more stone, more wealth, yet tomorrow does not always arrive. He tells of one ruler who ordered a palace vast enough to house his entire court, its foundations stretching across a plain, its design a labyrinth of courts and gardens, pillars carved with stories of gods and ancestors. For a decade the work thundered with chisels and hammers, masons sweating under the sun, artists carving lintels, engineers aligning channels of water. But then the ruler died suddenly, his heirs quarrelled, and the work stopped in a single season. The palace stood abandoned, scaffolds rotting, half-carved lions staring sightlessly, the air filling with sand until the structure seemed less like a ruin than a thought interrupted. In another tale, he describes a mountain valley where stone was quarried for a fortress palace meant to endure forever, blocks dragged for miles, inscriptions begun. Yet famine came, draining labourers from the task, and rebellion followed. The half-built fortress never became a citadel but a ghost of one, its towers barely rising above ground, foundations laid like bones without flesh. To later travellers, it seemed eerie, a place where effort was poured into earth but never crowned, a reminder that not all ambition survives, the uncertainties of weather, of politics, of human mortality. The storyteller pauses on the image of stairways that end in open sky, their steps smoothed by no feet, awaiting ceremonies that never occurred. He reflects that unfinished palaces are not merely ruins, they are monuments to possibility, to what might have been, their silence filled with imagined voices, imagined dances, imagined festivals. Unlike other ruins, which speak of life once lived, unfinished palaces speak of life never lived, of feasts never tasted, music never played, rulers never crowned. And in this absence there lies a peculiar stillness, a tenderness for the fragility of plans. He guides you to the details, carved capitals stacked but never set upon columns, cisterns dug but never filled with water, courtyards lined with walls that never held tapestries. In the moonlight, such places look almost complete, shadows finishing what stone could not, and one can almost believe that with dawn, the workers will return. But dawn comes only with bird song and wind, no footsteps, no chisels. The palace remains dust, dust upon dust, and in his soft cadence, he reminds you that incompletion is not failure, it is another form of memory. The world is full of beginnings that do not reach conclusions, and often those beginnings are lovelier for their openness, their invitation to imagine. An unfinished palace is like an unfinished lullaby. Its silence allows the listener to drift into dreams, filling the gaps with their own gentle visions. So he leaves you standing within a hall that ends in air, moonlight flooding across unfinished stone, dust rising with the night breeze, scaffolds leaning like skeletal trees. The workers are gone, the rulers forgotten, but the dream they began still lingers, quiet as breath, tender as sleep, and in that half-completed silence you may rest, knowing that not every story needs an ending to be beautiful. The curse of the abandoned mines. The voice sinks lower, echoing now into caverns and shafts where the earth was once carved open by human hunger for silver, copper, tin, and gold, where miners carried flickering lamps deep into veins of rock, chisels striking sparks in darkness, carts rattling with ore, the air heavy with dust and the distant drip of water. He tells you that empires grew strong on the wealth drawn from these veins, for metals became swords, coins, jewelry, and tools. Yet every treasure carried a price, and often the mines themselves seemed to take revenge. Entire mountainsides, once honeycombed with shafts, now stand silent, their tunnels collapsing, their entrances sealed with rubble, as though the earth, exhausted by extraction, closed its own wounds. He describes one empire that sent generations of laborers into its hills, filling treasuries with silver so abundant that walls were plated and statues gleamed like moonlight. But greed pressed deeper each year, chasing veins thinner and thinner, until the shafts reached unstable rock. One night, an entire gallery caved in, burying hundreds. The survivors fled, refusing to return, whispering that the spirits of the mountain had grown wrathful. The mine was abandoned, tools left where they fell, lamps extinguished forever. When archaeologists stumbled upon it centuries later, they found pickaxes still leaning against walls, baskets of ore still half filled, as if time had stopped in a single dreadful moment. In another land, he says, there were copper mines so vast they glowed red with firelight at night, for smelters roared constantly, turning ore into metal. Slaves and prisoners were sent to dig, their lives consumed as fuel for the empire's hunger. But when the wars ended and demand slackened, the rulers closed the mines abruptly. The shafts stood open, yawning into the hills, like mouths that once devoured men and now spat only silence. Locals feared to enter, claiming the cries of the lost could still be heard, mingling with the sigh of wind through abandoned tunnels. He lingers on the haunting details: helmets dented by falling stones, ropes frayed and broken, inscriptions scratched onto walls by miners marking days and prayers, unfinished sentences cut short by collapse. These marks, he says softly, are perhaps the truest history, written not by kings, but by those who labored unseen, and their disappearance, sudden and complete, adds to the mystery. For whole villages once supported the mines, families of workers, smiths, mule drivers, yet, when the mines closed, the villages too were emptied, their houses left to crumble, their wells to dry. He reflects that mines are like empires themselves, dug deep in pursuit of riches, expanding until their own weight makes them unstable, their collapse inevitable. What seems wealth from one angle is exhaustion from another. What gleams in the sun above leaves scars in the dark below, and just as mines eventually close, so do empires, hollowed from within, their voices echoing only faintly in empty corridors. In the calm of his narration, he invites you to picture the abandoned shafts now, filled not with miners but with silence, their walls glittering faintly where veins of ore still run, as though the earth hid away treasures it refused to give up entirely. Bats flutter softly in the upper chambers, water pools in the lowest, and the smell of damp stone lingers. No footsteps sound here any more, and yet the place feels inhabited by memory, by whispers, by the deep patience of the mountain. And so he leaves you with the image of a shaft opening onto starlight, wind sighing gently through beams that once held the earth at bay, the night air cool, the silence complete. These abandoned mines, he assures you, are not curses, but lessons, that the earth is never truly conquered, only borrowed, and that all riches come at a cost. To rest within that truth is to accept the rhythm of rise and fall, and in that acceptance, peace, like sleep, comes quietly. The empire, swallowed by the sea, the voice carries you now to the restless edge of the world, where land and water wrestle for dominion, and where once a mighty empire spread its harbours, its shipyards, its gleaming quays, confident that the sea which fed it with trade and power would forever remain an ally. Slowly, he guides you to picture stone breakwaters stretching out into blue waters, fleets anchored in rows, sails folded like wings at rest, warehouses piled high with grain and timber, amphorae of oil, stacked in shadowed vaults. The empire thrived because of the sea. It fished its depths, traded across horizons, drew wealth from waves. Yet one day, in ways no chronicler fully explained, the sea turned against it. Storms rose higher, tides shifted, earthquakes shook the seabed, and harbours that had once been busy with merchants were drowned, leaving only silence and foam. He describes a great coastal capital where a royal palace stood near the shore, its colonnades reflecting in calm waters, gardens perfumed with salt breeze. But one night, tremors cracked the earth, and the sea surged inward, devouring streets, collapsing walls. Survivors told of lanterns snuffed out by waves, of ships torn from their moorings and hurled into houses, of statues toppled and swallowed. By dawn, half the city lay beneath the tide, its rooftops just barely visible before disappearing entirely. The empire's heart had been torn away, and though remnants clung to the hills above, they never recovered. The sea had claimed what human pride believed permanent. In another story, he recalls an island realm whose wealth came from pearls and coral, traded across oceans. For centuries, divers plumbed the reefs, merchants sailed with their goods, temples rose in thanks to gods of tide and wind. Yet, as the seas slowly rose, the island's shores eroded, temples tumbled into surf, and markets flooded season by season. The people fought back, building seawalls and levees, but the ocean was patient, relentless. Eventually, the entire island slipped beneath waves, its memory preserved only in the faint glimmer of stone blocks seen beneath clear water, where fish swim now through what were once doorways. He lingers on the details of drowned ruins, columns standing upright beneath the waves, encrusted with coral, statues softened by barnacles, mosaics where fish dart among tiles of blue and gold. Divers centuries later return to these places, descending through green water, torches sputtering, astonished to find cities still recognizable beneath the sea. Silent avenues where no footsteps fall, only currents wandering. To swim there was to drift between worlds, the living and the lost. The storyteller reflects in his soothing cadence that the sea is both giver and taker, friend and destroyer, offering abundance while reminding mortals that permanence belongs not to harbours but to tides. An empire may command armies, write laws, build monuments, but it cannot command the sea. And when the sea chooses to rise, the empire dissolves not with fire but with foam, its stones scattered like shells. Yet even this ending, he assures you, is not despair. For beneath the waves, life continues. Fish nest in courtyards, reefs bloom where palaces once stood. Seagrass bends across amphitheatres, turning ruin into a new kingdom. The drowned empire sleeps not in emptiness but in transformation, its silence filled with the soft music of currents, the shimmer of scales, the slow rocking of waves overhead. And so he leaves you with the image of moonlight rippling across water where once towers stood, the surface hiding mysteries below. Somewhere beneath, a city still rests, its arches intact, its streets aligned, its memory preserved in the hush of the sea. And as you imagine the rhythm of waves, you too are rocked gently, carried toward rest, as though the sea that swallowed empires now cradles you in its embrace. Walls without defenders. The voice leads you inland again, to fortresses and strongholds that still stand proud against the horizon, their battlements sharp, their towers unbroken, their gates massive and studded with iron yet eerily empty, without soldiers to guard them, without banners to flutter above. He asks you to walk slowly along these walls in your mind, tracing the stonework with your gaze, marveling at how perfectly the courses align, how carefully the architects designed every parapet, and yet sensing the strangeness of it all. The defences remain, but the defenders are gone, vanished as though they had dissolved into the air. He tells you of one mountain citadel, perched high above valleys, whose walls were so strong that no army dared attack. The sight of its ramparts alone was enough to discourage invasion. For centuries it stood unconquered, its people safe behind gates that no siege could breach. But then, without war, without battle, the citadel was abandoned. Archaeologists later found its storerooms still filled with jars, its wells still full of water, its gates still closed from within. Yet no bodies, no signs of massacre, no trace of struggle. The defenders had simply walked away, leaving the fortress intact, as though responding to a summons from the earth itself. In another tale, he describes a coastal fortress that had once watched the horizon for sails, its towers lit with beacon fires to warn of pirates. The walls endure even now, battered by salt wind, but the garrison vanished centuries ago. No record explains why. The fires went out, the gates rusted, and travellers passing by found only empty barracks, weapons neatly stored, armour still hanging in rows. It was as if the soldiers had laid down their duty and slipped quietly into the night. The storyteller lingers on the mystery. Walls so carefully built, yet never tested in battle. Gates so strong, yet never battered by rams. These defences were never destroyed, they simply ceased to matter. He reflects softly that walls do not protect against silence, against dwindling harvests, against trade routes shifting, against rulers failing to inspire loyalty. Sometimes the people behind them simply decide the effort is no longer worth it, and the strongest fortress becomes a shell, guarding nothing but echoes. He guides you to notice the details of these empty fortresses. Arrow slits framing only sky, staircases spiralling up to towers where no sentries stand, courtyards where grass pushes through cracks, wells where frogs croak in the absence of men. In moonlight, such fortresses seem alive still, their shadows deep and solemn, yet no voice calls from the parapets, no torch glows at the gatehouse. The silence is profound, and yet it is not menacing. It is restful, as though the walls themselves have retired, content at last to stand without strain. In his calm cadence, he reflects that walls are the body of empire, built to endure, while people are its breath, and when the breath ceases, the body remains, impressive but lifeless. To find walls without defenders is to find the shell of power, grand yet hollow, a reminder that endurance of stone does not equal endurance of spirit. And so he leaves you standing before an unbroken wall under stars, your hand resting upon its cool surface, the silence stretching outward like a calm sea. No battle was fought here, no conquest written in blood, only departure, only the quiet unravelling of purpose. The walls endure, serene, and in their serenity they invite you too to rest, to find comfort in stillness rather than vigilance, in emptiness rather than alarm. The festival that never ended. The voice carries you now into the memory of laughter and music, of garlands and torches, of processions winding through streets that have long since fallen silent. He speaks gently of a city remembered not for its fall in battle or its ruin by famine, but for a celebration that seemed to consume it, a festival begun with joy and never concluded, as if the rhythm of drums and the swirl of dancers became the final heartbeat of its people. Slowly, he guides your mind into its avenues. Banners of bright cloth once hung between balconies, trumpets called out in the dawn, and ovens burned all day baking bread for feasts. At night, lamps illuminated masks painted with gold, and wine poured freely, so freely that the streets themselves smelled of grapes. Yet within generations, the city was gone, its ruins buried beneath soil, its name lost, and legend claimed that it had danced itself into oblivion. He describes one account of merchants who once visited during its festival season, astonished to find trade suspended, all work paused, the entire city given over to revelry. Days turned to weeks, weeks to months, yet still the drums beat and the fires flared. The merchants departed bewildered, and when they returned seasons later, they found the gates shut, the streets empty. The festival ended not in joy but in abandonment. Some whispered of plague carried by crowds, others of famine caused by neglect, still others of rulers who demanded perpetual celebration to distract from decay. But none can be sure, for all that remains are fragments of masks, broken instruments, and murals showing dancers whose feet are worn away by time. He lingers on the imagery, an amphitheatre where steps are still stained with wine, a plaza where the grooves of dancers' sandals are etched into stone, a temple whose altar is covered not in solemn offerings but in painted ribbons, preserved beneath layers of dust. These details suggest a people who poured their spirit into joy, until joy itself became unsustainable. Their festival was not a single day but a surrender, a way of forgetting hardship, until hardship returned in force and swept them away. The storyteller softens his tone, reminding you that every empire has its festival, its golden season of abundance when worries feel distant and streets are filled with laughter. Yet, such moments, however sweet, cannot last forever. Just as dawn follows night, silence follows music, and when a people cannot set aside celebration, they risk losing the balance that sustains them. Still, there is no cruelty in this tale, only a strange tenderness, for the city's last memory is not of suffering but of joy, and he invites you to rest in that image. Streets glowing with lanterns, the air filled with the hum of lyres and the rhythm of drums, faces smiling behind painted masks, wine flowing, laughter rising. The city may have vanished, but its spirit lingers, caught forever in a dance beneath the stars. To imagine it is to hear the faint echo of music across centuries, an echo not of sorrow but of delight, fading gently into the quiet of night. The silent roads. The voice turns now to the long lines that once stitched empires together, roads laid with such care that they still hold their course centuries after the feet and wheels that wore them have disappeared. Slowly, he leads you along their straight stretches across plains, their winding paths through mountain passes, their elegant arches where bridges crossed rivers. Once, these roads echoed with the steady tramp of soldiers, the creak of carts laden with grain, the jingle of camel bells, the laughter of pilgrims, the cries of merchants hawking wares as caravans paused at inns. They were arteries of empire, carrying news, tribute, armies, and ideas. Yet now they stretch outward in silence, their stones warmed only by sun, their ruts filled with rainwater, their milestones leaning like forgotten sentinels. He recalls one empire that built a road so vast and straight it seemed to defy the curve of the earth, stretching for hundreds of miles, lined with trees planted at intervals, with way stations offering rest and food. It was said a letter could travel from one end of the empire to the other faster than a season's change. Yet when the empire fell, the road remained, its inns crumbling, its trees dying, the traffic ceasing. Travelers who came later found the pavement still intact, but no caravans upon it, no guards to protect it, no destination worth reaching. The road led only into emptiness. In another story, he describes a highland kingdom whose roads were carved into the sides of cliffs, supported by retaining walls of stone so precise they stand even now, unmoved by centuries of wind and rain. Once, processions of kings ascended these paths, their banners fluttering above, priests scattering petals before them. Now, only goats climb them, their hooves clicking where once drums thundered. The walls endure, the stairs endure, but the purpose has faded into silence. The storyteller draws your attention to the details. Grooves in stone carved by chariot wheels, so deep that they outlasted the empires that made them. Milestones inscribed with distances to capitals whose names are no longer known. Cisterns dug by the roadside, still filling with rain though no travelers drink. These fragments remind you that roads were not only practical but symbolic. They proclaimed order, control, ambition. They were promises that the empire could reach everywhere, bind all lands together. Yet promises falter when no one remains to keep them. He reflects gently that the silence of roads is not sorrowful but peaceful. For roads are patient, they do not resist being forgotten. They wait, grass weaving across their surfaces, roots cracking their stones, streams trickling over their bridges, and when wanderers stumble upon them, the roads welcome their footsteps, as they once welcomed caravans, unjudging, unchanged. So he leaves you with the image of a straight road, stretching to the horizon under a pale moon, its stones glowing faintly, its edges blurred with weeds. No voices, no wheels, only the soft sound of wind across its length. It leads nowhere now, yet in its emptiness there is comfort, the reminder that movement once existed, that connection once thrived, and that silence, too, is a kind of destination. The vanished heirs. The voice drifts into the secret chambers of dynasties, where bloodlines once seemed unbroken as the stars, each generation rising to claim the throne, their lineage proclaimed in carvings, in scrolls, in genealogies recited like sacred hymns. And yet, there are stories of realms where that thread suddenly snapped, heirs disappearing without trace, thrones left empty, and with them the very spine of empire bending and breaking. Slowly, he guides you to imagine throne rooms, where golden seats stood waiting, crowns resting on cushions, ceremonial robes laid ready, but no prince, no princess, no rightful heir arrived to claim them. He recalls one empire whose king had many children, each trained in statecraft, war, and ritual. Chroniclers describe their education, their early triumphs, the promise of a long dynasty. Yet when the king died, not a single heir appeared. Some say plague swept through the palace, others that rivals poisoned them, or that priests spirited them away in secret. What remains certain is that the throne was left vacant, and within months the empire fractured into provinces, each claiming loyalty to ghosts. Later inscriptions beg the absent heirs to return, prayers etched into stone that went unanswered. In another tale, he speaks of a mountain kingdom where heirs vanished one by one over generations, not all at once, but mysteriously, as if claimed by fate. Some died young, some disappeared on journeys, others left no children, until at last the last ruler stood alone with no successor. The court tried desperately to adopt distant relatives, to graft new branches onto the royal tree, but none took root. When that final monarch died, the palace gates closed, and the people dispersed, the dynasty's absence as final as a candle extinguished by wind. The storyteller lingers on the unsettling calm of such disappearances. Empires are built on continuity, on the belief that someone always comes after, but when the line ends, the structure wavers like a tower without foundation. He points to inscriptions where artisans chiseled names of kings, generation after generation, until the last followed by blank stone. He guides you to imagine court musicians whose songs faltered, scribes who sharpened their reeds in vain, guards who stood watch over doors that would never open. And yet, he softens the thought, suggesting that heirs do not always vanish into nothing. Some fled into exile, carrying their bloodlines into obscurity, perhaps living humbly in villages, their descendants unaware of the crowns in their ancestry. Others may have been absorbed into rival dynasties, their heritage hidden beneath new names. In this way, empire does not end so much as dissolve, its legacy dispersed like rain soaking invisibly into soil. He reflects gently that the mystery of vanished heirs is a reminder that no bloodline, however exalted, is permanent. Thrones are carved in gold, but lineage is fragile, subject to the smallest accident, the briefest illness, the quietest betrayal. And yet, in their disappearance lies a strange tranquility, for power lost can also mean burdens released. So he leaves you with the image of an empty throne hall, moonlight streaming through high windows, the crown glimmering faintly on its cushion, untouched. No footsteps approach, no herald calls, no heir enters. Only silence reigns, and in that silence there is peace, a reminder that even absence can rule with quiet dignity. Ruins beneath the forest. The voice deepens, drawing you into green shadow, into forests where vines creep and roots twist like serpents, where the air hums with insects and the ground is softened by centuries of falling leaves. He tells you gently that within these jungles and woodlands lie cities once immense, their avenues aligned with stars, their plazas filled with markets and temples. Now they are hidden, cloaked beneath canopies so thick that sunlight breaks through only in fragments. Slowly, he guides your mind's eye along paths where moss covers walls, orchids cling to broken arches, and ceiba trees grow through stairways once polished by thousands of feet. He recalls a realm where stone pyramids rose above plains, their steps painted in red and white, where kings were carried in processions to high terraces to greet the dawn. When drought and war came, the people drifted away, but the jungle did not wait. Roots split stones, vines wrapped themselves around columns, parrots nested in temple rafters, jaguars prowled through abandoned courtyards. By the time explorers stumbled upon them centuries later, the ruins seemed less like human creations than works of nature itself, swallowed and remade. In another land, he speaks of temples carved with faces of gods and kings, each gaze serene, each smile eternal. When the empire fell, the forest closed in, cloaking the sculptures in shadow. Rain wore down their lines, lichen softened their gaze, and branches embraced them like long-lost kin. Villagers who came upon them whispered of spirits dwelling within the trees, believing the ruins to be alive. And in a way, they were alive with the patient work of roots, rain, and growth. The storyteller lingers on the uncanny peace of such places. Unlike ruins burned or drowned, forest ruins are never empty. They are filled with birdsong, rustling leaves, scents of flowers. They are not reminders of absence but of transformation, human stone becoming part of nature's endless architecture. He invites you to picture a doorway framed by massive roots, the tree rising higher than the palace once stood, its crown shimmering in light while its roots hold fast to the past. He reflects gently that the forest does not erase but enfolds. It keeps the memory of empire safe beneath shade, preserving carvings in cool dampness, wrapping walls in green embrace. What once was conquest and command is softened into silence, into the slow rhythm of growth. And in this, there is no cruelty, only inevitability. All things return to the earth, and the earth returns them with patience. So he leaves you with the image of a forest at dusk, cicadas rising in chorus, fireflies glowing over mossy stairs, stone faces watching serenely through veils of vines. The empire is gone, but the forest thrives, carrying the memory not as ruin but as part of its own living body. In such places, silence is never empty. It is alive, restful, filled with breath. And within that breath, you too may rest, as though the forest has enfolded you, protecting you in its endless green. The endless sleep of empires. The voice softens to its gentlest cadence, as though the entire journey through vanished realms has been leading here to a final reflection on how all empires, no matter their splendor or mystery, eventually surrender themselves to rest. He asks you to close your eyes and imagine the vast tapestry of history, towers rising and falling, rivers shifting, markets humming then falling silent, ships abandoned upon dry earth, temples emptied of gods, fortresses left without defenders, forests embracing stones, seas covering cities. Each story is unique, yet together they form a single truth that nothing endures forever. And in that impermanence lies a calm deeper than permanence itself. He recalls gently how kings once boasted of eternal dominion, carving their names into walls of granite, only for those names to erode until even their language is unreadable. He reminds you how artisans poured their skill into treasures that were lost, and yet the memory of their hands lingers in fragments. He points to roads that still stretch into emptiness, thrones left vacant, and libraries sealed, as if the past itself chose to sleep. And he suggests that these are not tragedies but natural rhythms, rise and fall, bloom and decay, the endless breathing of human endeavor. In his slow narration, he compares empires to living beings. They are born in sparks of ambition, they grow strong with labor and unity, they shine with festivals and victories, they weaken with neglect or misfortune, and at last they sleep, leaving only echoes behind. Just as people cannot remain forever awake, neither can nations remain forever vigilant. Sleep is not defeat but renewal, a surrender to the flow of time. And so, the ruins you have wandered through are not graves but dreams. Dreams the earth is still holding, quietly, patiently, until they are needed again in memory or imagination. He invites you to walk one last time among them, past the silent markets where only wind drifts, beneath the watchful eyes of stone guardians, along roads that lead into horizons, into forests humming with life. Each place whispers not of loss but of continuity, of how human stories never vanish but fold gently into the larger story of the world. The empires are gone, but their presence remains, softened, hushed, eternal in their own way. And finally, he leaves you with the image of all these empires lying side by side beneath the night sky, each one asleep, their towers turned to starlight, their walls blending into hills, their songs transformed into the rustling of leaves or the crash of waves. They rest without struggle, without regret, like great travelers who have laid down their burdens. You too are invited to share in that rest, to feel the serenity of their endless sleep settling over you like a blanket, deep, cool, and safe. The story closes not with an ending, but with a hush, a lull, a gentle reminder that just as empires sleep, so too may you. And in that shared silence, where time itself seems to pause, you drift into the same peace, the endless sleep of empires, timeless, tranquil, complete.